In 2014, a team of geneticists finished an analysis that was supposed to be routine, and instead found themselves staring at a result that felt almost impossible. They had been mapping the DNA of Ashkenazi Jews, and the data kept insisting on something that sounds like it simply can't be true. Nearly every Ashkenazi Jew alive today, around 10 million people, appears to descend from a single founding population so small it could have fit inside one medieval village. A few hundred people. Which means that any two Ashkenazi Jews on Earth, chosen completely at random, are something like 30th cousins. Strangers who have never met, on opposite sides of the planet, carrying overlapping pieces of the very same handful of ancestors. Now hold that thought, because somewhere on that impossibly narrow family tree sits a patent clerk from Bern with wild hair and a head full of light beams. His name was Albert Einstein, and what modern genetics reveals about the bloodline he came from is stranger and far more human than the myth of the lone genius who simply fell out of the sky. Let me be honest with you right up front, because this channel doesn't deal in fairy tales. Nobody has sequenced Albert Einstein's personal genome and put it on display. There is no secret vial with his name on it. But his ancestry is documented in remarkable detail, and it places him squarely inside one of the most extraordinary genetic stories ever uncovered. To understand Einstein's blood, you first have to understand the tree he grew on. And that tree rewrites the whole story of where a mind like his comes from. Start with the documented facts of his life. Albert Einstein was born in 1979 in Ulm, a city in the South German region of Swabia, into an Ashkenazi Jewish family whose roots reach back generations into the small Jewish communities of the German Southwest, places where his people had lived, traded, married, and prayed for a very long time. The family soon moved to Munich, where his father and uncle ran an electrical business. He was not religious in any conventional synagogue-going sense. But, and this matters enormously, he never once hid or apologized for what he was. As the Nazis rose, he became a target precisely because he was a Jew, and he fled Germany for good. He helped raise money for the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and left it his personal papers. And in 1952, he was formally offered the presidency of the young state of Israel. He declined. He said he lacked the aptitude for it, but he called his bond to the Jewish people the strongest human tie he had. The heritage was never a footnote to Einstein. It was, by his own account, central to how he understood himself. A few more threads make the family portrait sharper, and they matter more than they first appear. The surname Einstein is itself an Old German Jewish name meaning roughly one stone, precisely the kind of ordinary German word that Jewish families in the German lands were handed when the state forced them to take surnames, generations before Albert was ever born. He had a younger sister, Maja, to whom he stayed devoted his entire life. As a boy, he was no obvious prodigy on paper. He chafed against the rigid, militaristic Munich schools and eventually walked away from one of them altogether, all while privately turning over the deepest questions in physics, teaching himself advanced mathematics, famously wondering what the world would look like if he could ride alongside a beam of light. And when the Nazis seized power in 1933, everything his heritage meant turned brutally, literally real. Einstein, already abroad, never set foot in Germany again. The country that had produced him now wanted him dead. His property was seized, his physics publicly denounced as so-called Jewish science, and a bounty was reportedly placed on his head, all for the accident of his birth. He lived out his final decades in Princeton, New Jersey, an exile and a refugee who had lost his homeland to hatred. The most famous scientist on Earth was, in the end, a living embodiment of the whole Ashkenazi story compressed into a single lifetime: brilliance, belonging, persecution, exile, and survival. Now here is where the science turns the familiar story completely on its head. We tend to picture a genius like Einstein as a kind of lightning strike, a singular, isolated, unrepeatable event, unconnected to anyone before or around him. The genetics say almost the opposite. His bloodline was not isolated at all. It was one of the most tightly interconnected populations in all of human history. If that idea grabs you the way it grabbed me, do me a quick favor and hit the like button. It really does help this kind of history reach more curious people. And if you want more stories where science and heritage collide, subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. Now let me show you how a bloodline gets wound this tight. Roughly 600 to 800 years ago, the Ashkenazi Jewish population passed through what geneticists call a bottleneck. For reasons of persecution, expulsion, migration, and sheer survival, the community shrank down to a very small founding group, by one influential 2014 estimate, as few as around 350 people, and then, over the centuries that followed, expanded outward into the millions. When a population balloons out from that few founders in so short a time, every descendant ends up carrying overlapping fragments of the same tiny ancestral set. And it goes further still. A separate landmark study traced a huge share of all Ashkenazi maternal lines back to just 4 founding mothers. 4 women standing behind millions and millions of people alive today. And you can actually see the fingerprints of that bottleneck to this day, not in a history book, but in a hospital. When a population passes through so narrow a genetic gate, rare conditions carried by those few founders get concentrated and handed down at unusual rates. It is exactly why certain genetic conditions, Tay-Sachs disease the most well-known among them, appear more frequently in Ashkenazi families, and why specific founder mutations, including particular BRCA mutations tied to cancer risk, are common enough that doctors now screen for them by name in Ashkenazi patients. I want to be careful how I put this because it is not a story about anything being wrong with the population. It is the opposite. Those shared mutations are simply the medical echo of that tiny band of medieval founders. Still ringing 800 years later, the very same bottleneck we've been tracing, just read through a different instrument. And it drives home in the most concrete way imaginable just how interconnected this population really is. 2 Ashkenazi Jews who look nothing alike, who speak different languages and were born on opposite sides of the planet, can sit down, compare their DNA, and discover long, identical stretches of genetic code inherited from a single shared ancestor only a handful of centuries back. They are, quite literally, cousins, and they almost always have no idea. That is the web Albert Einstein was woven into, as tightly as anyone who has ever lived. The equations were his and his alone. The bloodline was shared by millions, and those founders themselves carry a migration written into the blood. The Ashkenazi genome is, very roughly, about half Middle Eastern and about half European in origin, the signature of a community whose paternal lines trace back to the ancient Levant, and whose story then wound through southern Europe, likely Italy, before settling into the German Rhineland and pushing east into Poland and Russia. Then, crucially, it sealed itself off through centuries of marrying within the community. Einstein was a product of that entire 1,000-year journey. The Near East and the Rhineland, braided together across 100 generations, and finally handed to a boy in Ulm. Now, I want to be very careful here, because this is exactly the point where people love to wander off into territory the science does not support. It has become a kind of parlor game to ask why so many towering figures, Einstein foremost among them, came out of this one small population, and to reach for explanations that make the bloodline itself sound magical, superior, chosen. Let me be blunt, because it matters. That is not what the genetics shows, and this channel will not pretend otherwise. A founder bottleneck does not manufacture genius. It concentrates whatever the founders happen to carry, including, by the way, a set of well-known genetic diseases, and nothing about it hands out Nobel Prizes. So, what did the bloodline actually give him? Not a magic gene. Something you can see far more clearly in the history than in the DNA of culture. The communities Einstein came from placed an almost unreasonable value on study, on questions, on argument, on literacy, on turning ideas over and over until they cracked open. That reverence for the life of the mind was carried across centuries of exile, precisely because it was one of the few things a hunted, wandering people were always allowed to keep. Einstein's brilliance was entirely his own. But the world that sharpened it, that treated a hard question as something close to holy, that was an inheritance, not a genetic gift, a cultural one passed hand to hand, generation to generation. Consider what that actually looked like on the ground. For centuries, in communities that were barred from owning land, locked out of the guilds, and expelled from one country after another, the single form of wealth that could never be seized at a border was whatever a person carried inside their own head. So learning became sacred in the most practical sense imaginable. Children were taught to read and to argue over difficult texts from a very young age. A sharp question was prized rather than punished. Debate itself became a kind of devotion, and whole communities organized their life around study. None of that is written in a gene, but all of it is written into a way of life, and it was handed down just as faithfully as any surname, in good times and in catastrophe. So when Einstein said that the important thing is never to stop questioning, he was not spinning a clever personal motto out of thin air. He was voicing, whether he framed it this way or not, something that 100 generations before him had already lived by. And that leads to the real revelation, the thing that actually turns the lone genius myth inside out. The man we treat as the most singular mind of the modern age was, genetically, bound to millions of other people by threads only a few centuries long. The distant cousins scattered across 3 continents who never understood a word of his equations but shared his ancestors. The relatives who did not survive the century he lived through. When you trace Einstein's bloodline backward, it does not narrow down to a single miraculous point. It opens outward into a vast, densely woven web of utterly ordinary families who carried the same fragile inheritance through expulsion after expulsion, and simply refused to let it break. There's a strange kind of comfort in that. We put Einstein on a pedestal so high that he stops looking human at all. The genetics quietly reaches up, pulls him back down, and sets him gently among his people. He is not a bolt of lightning from an empty sky. He is a leaf, an extraordinary one. Yes, on a tree whose roots run to the ancient Near East, whose trunk survived a medieval bottleneck, and whose branches reach into 10 million living people today, some of whom might be watching this very video, carrying a little of the same ancestry as the man who rewrote the universe. That is what the bloodline reveals. Not a secret formula for genius, there isn't one. Something better and truer. Proof that even our most singular figures are carried by a shared inheritance. That no one, not even Einstein, ever really stands alone. So, thank you for watching this all the way to the end. And if the question of what the blood reveals about the famous is pulling at you now, I've put the perfect next investigation right here on your screen, where we take one of the most famous men in all of history, Christopher Columbus, and a stunning new DNA study blows the question of who he really was wide open. It's playing right now. Go watch it.